On today's World Insight, Omicron emerges as the latest COVID variant. We speak to one of the world's premier vaccine experts to see if vaccines can keep up with the COVID mutations.
People are saying, well, most of the people that we've seen with cases of Omicron have not been that severe. Remember that many of those people were vaccinated, and that's exactly what vaccination does. It keeps you from having a severe case of COVID-19.
And a documentary filmmaker attempts to tell China's story at a time of China-U.S. tensions. What hurdles does he face trying to present an unbiased account of China to the Western audience?
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The World Health Organization says the Omicron variant has spread to 19 countries, with confirmed COVID-19 cases worldwide surpassing already 262 million and over 5 million deaths. Global vaccine makers have announced efforts to upgrade vaccines against Omicron, with China's CanSino and Biotech announcing they began data collection and analysis. Pfizer-BioNTech also started work on the variant. On Friday, Johnson & Johnson confirmed it is testing the efficacy of its vaccine against Omicron. So far, what do we know for a fact about the new variant and how effective the current vaccines are against it? I earlier spoke to Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Let's listen in. Dr. Kim, tell us more about how vaccines are going to function under the current circumstance with the Omicron, the new variant.
Omicron is interesting and different. It has far more mutations than the other principal variants of concern. The spike protein, that mushroom-shaped knob that sits on the outside of the virus, for Omicron has up to 25 individual mutations. There are first, those mutations that we think makes it easier for the virus to spread in human populations. So mutations that make the virus more transmissible. The second set are those that make it easier for the virus to enter human cells. These may be important to may make the virus infection more severe. Then there are mutations that may make the virus more resistant to some of the protective immune responses that we get when we're infected, when we're vaccinated. Then, over the next 10 to 14 days, you'll start hearing about the test tube. And then finally, in the order of months or so, we'll probably start to hear of whether this new virus, this Omicron variant, causes more severe infection. So when it comes to the vaccines, it's probable, in fact, that the vaccines still offer some level of protection, but we really don't know how much.
We do not know, as to this point, how much vaccines over the past few years have helped us in terms of percentage of preventing progressing of COVID-19. Do we know or not?
That's a great question. So remember when we did all those big phase 3 trials, this was last year, and we were analyzing 30,000 volunteers in some of these clinical trials. And that actually told us pretty clearly that the vaccines reduced or prevented mild to moderate disease and were safe. And then now we've dispensed almost 8 billion doses of these vaccines around the world. And we have pretty good evidence for all of the WHO approved vaccines that they, in the real world now, this is real world evidence, reduce severe infection, hospitalization, and death. So yes, the vaccines are very good at that. And it's very important that as many people around the world have access to these vaccines as possible. And this is something that Omicron illustrates so well, as Delta did before. And that is that outbreaks cause variants and variants cause outbreaks. And until we can break the cycle of variants and outbreaks, we will always be threatened by something that we don't know is going to arise.
But on the other hand, Dr. Kim, we see that many of those patients who actually eventually got COVID-19, particularly with Omicron recently, they are already the ones being vaccinated.
So remember, the phase 3 trials looked at the ability of the vaccines to prevent mild to moderate disease that was PCR positive. they didn't really look at the ability of the vaccines to prevent infection. And in fact, most of the vaccines that we use today actually prevent mild to moderate, prevent the manifestations of disease rather than preventing infection. Data from the United States says, compared to people who are not vaccinated, people who are vaccinated have an 11-fold decrease in the risk of death. And that is borne out over time. It's not an effect that disappears. So it's a very important point to make to people to protect yourself.
Which is more effective, to have a third dose for those who already have 2 doses of vaccines approved by WHO, or to have the rest of the world with certain speed having their first and second doses of vaccines to you?
Yes, so if we were back in January, equity and access were front and center. Equity and access are still important, but one of the things that we sometimes lose track of is companies are now manufacturing between 1.5 and 2 billion doses of vaccine a month. WHO estimates perhaps that maybe by the middle to the late part of next year, 70% of the world will be vaccinated. So the problem is going to get better because we have greater access to vaccines. And some of the new vaccines, for instance, the vaccine from the Chinese company Clover, but a Korean company and a French company, Sanofi, are testing similar types of protein-based vaccines, appear to have very high levels of protection. And not only that, they have the very interesting now proof that if you were already infected and you're vaccinated, you have even more protection than infection alone. And I think all of these things are making a very strong case that we should vaccinate everyone as quickly as possible. We have a lot of vaccine. The issue is distribution. And we'll increasingly have more vaccine as the year ends and next year starts. And we have to make sure that some of those vaccines are getting to the people who need them in countries around the world.
Right. That is given if things like Omicron did not go beyond our imagination, or in other words, did not go beyond the level of infections and the infectious degrees than the earlier variants, right? If it did, or if other new variants after that, or at the same time appearing, did that, then all these numbers will have been changed.
Yes, and you're making a very good point, because one of the issues that we always talk about the shortage of vaccine, or the fact that vaccines are not equitably distributed. But last year, WHO and another product development partnership called FIND published a report that said there's a diagnostics gap. The diagnostics gap is $2 billion. And it means that in some parts of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, we don't have enough kits. We don't do enough diagnosis. If you were to look at a map of the world where the hot spots are now, and you were to look at Africa, it doesn't look like they have many infections, yet that's where Omicron came from. So one of the things that the wealthier countries can do is to work to develop the capacity to improve diagnosis in all countries around the world, and also to improve the tracking of mutants. So and I'm going to use this data from the GSAID database, in the month before the emergence of Omicron, Africa submitted 200 full-length sequences. Europe submitted 161,000. So if we were to improve the ability of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa to make diagnoses and to do sequencing, we would greatly improve our own ability to know when these variants that you mentioned and that we're very concerned about will emerge. We don't know yet about Omicron. Is it more infectious or not? Is disease more severe or not? You know, some people are saying, well, most of the people that we've seen with cases of Omicron have not been that severe. Remember that many of those people were vaccinated, and that's exactly what vaccination does. It keeps you from having a severe case of COVID-19.
Let's just assume, Dr. Kim, that the vaccines that we talked about, mainly approved and recognized by WHO, did work. However, the duration of time in which it could work actually could be suggested not as long as we want. That's why we need to have an extra shot. But the question really is, how many extra shots can we afford?
So do we really want to be giving people vaccinations every 6 months? And I think you're absolutely right. The answer is no, it's impractical. And so we need to find, and again, this gets to the idea that science should never stop just because we have the vaccines that we have now. The hope for the future may be that there are groups that are working on what we call universal vaccines, or vaccines that should work against future mutant viruses. And if we have those, then potentially we'll have the vaccine that should protect us against the most commonly or most likely to occur set of mutants in the future. And then there are even groups that are even farther along and working on what we call pan-coronavirus vaccines. So vaccines that might work against MERS or SARS-1 in addition to COVID-19. And those vaccines, although they're still early stage, again, have the potential to protect us against a broad class of viruses.
Different kinds of control and prevention policies. For example, China has a zero tolerance, quote unquote, policy, while other countries have already have seen a tremendous amount of cases of COVID-19. Of course, there are making populations that are COVID naive, populations that are not necessarily so. So what does that mean for vaccines functions on these different populations? Do we know much? Are we doing research about that?
We're using what we call real-world evidence. That is data from the implementation of vaccination massively in countries around the world. So, for instance, Israel has been very effective in publishing and publicizing its work in vaccinating nearly its entire population. The United Kingdom, because it has vaccinated such a large proportion of the population, has been able to provide us a lot of very important information. Well-designed studies from the United States and other countries around the world are giving us really good insight into what it takes to protect people for longer periods of time. And I have to point out, the best guide to policy is to use information that we can collect, to devise plans, and to devise plans in case those our initial set of plans don't work. So to create a set of plan B. And sometimes countries have released all regulations and not had a backup plan. And then you have to explain to a population why you have to engage in lockdown again, or why you're going to have to require vaccination in order to go to the supermarket or go to a restaurant. These are the kinds of things that we should use our data to model, to predict, and to develop better policy.
And the Winter Olympics is coming. The Summer Olympics in Tokyo was actually celebrated by all over the world. So how do you see, at a time of such a big international events, prevention and control can be done, and vaccine work, the role of it could play?
I was very worried about the Summer Olympics, and I'm worried about the Winter Olympics. Whenever we have large crowds of people, we have the risk for large spreading events of COVID-19. It is possible, though, to use the best science that we have information on. So I think that it's possible to minimize risk, not possible to maybe eliminate risk, but to minimize the risk of large outbreaks. Vaccination will be a part of that. Masks will be a part of that. Controlling crowds to the extent that that's possible and keeping people from high-risk exposure situations. We have to use the best science that we have in order to control risk during important events like the Winter Olympics.
Jerome Kim, as always, thank you so much. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, a bridge between the East and the West through his work in film, movie director Malcolm Clark with insights on how to better angels with each other. Next.
We were trying to make a film that advocated for more understanding and more cooperation between China and the United States.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today, China is still a mystery to some people from the West. That's what Malcolm Clark, a two-time Oscar-winning director, said recently about how the world sees China. Originally from the UK, the renowned director has a dream of building a bridge with films connecting China and the rest of the world. Having worked in the film industry for 40 years, Clark traveled around the world to shoot documentaries. He has been filming in China since 1913. His work, Better Angels, is significant in many eyes for trying to bridge the divide between China and the United States. I earlier interviewed him about that movie, but recently I met him again in Guangzhou, one of the very first city open to the rest of the world in China. And our conversation began from the stories after the movie Better Angels. Mr. Clark.
It's been a long time.
Better Angels.
Yes.
That was the time when we met.
I remember that, yes.
Pleasant conversation. And you travel with all these families between the United States and China to tell their stories. Things are changing so fast, Mr. Clark.
Things are changing fast, but but you know what happened at the end of Better Angels was that we found that we were kind of on the wrong side of history.
China is in so many ways becoming what we sort of imagine ourselves to be. People go to China to get a glimpse of the future now when it comes to infrastructure and technology. And for us in the United States, that's threatening.
We were trying to make a film that that advocated for more understanding and more cooperation between China and the United States. And we found very much that, I mean, when we started the film, Trump was campaigning. When we were shooting the film, Trump was in the White House. And we found that the temperature was raised on the kind of animosity between the two countries, and Trump did everything in his power to amp up the antagonism and use China as a scapegoat for American problems. So that was a difficult period for us because, you know, I mean, I don't think we were crazy to think that the world's superpower and the world's nascent superpower should try and work together. It seemed like common sense.
Yes.
But
because the opposite would be very dangerous.
Because the opposite would be unthinkable. So, and so to some extent now what we're living with is the unthinkable, which is that the two nations are at loggerheads, and it's terribly sad because, you know, we met so many wonderful people who were invested in trying to bring China and the United States closer together. So it was just difficult.
Did you follow up with their stories? You know, just not necessarily shooting another movie, but just to know how they are functioning under the current circumstances.
Yes.
You know, the students, the workers.
To some extent, it was, you know, it's always, it's a challenge for a documentary filmmaker to stay in touch with all the people you meet. But there are some people who we know, for example, one story which I think is an example which speaks volumes. There was a man a Chinese man who bought a house that Xi Jinping slept in and stayed in during one of his visits to the United States. The Chinese man bought that house and wanted to turn it into a museum to bring Chinese people to America, to show them more about America, to explain more about America. It was a very good idea, and it was a very simple idea, and it went nowhere because the prevailing kind of political currents were very much in the opposite direction, and he kind of went out of business. So it was sad to see that, and I think that's what's happened generally. There's been a kind of souring of the atmosphere between the two countries.
What does it mean for an artist like you?
Well, it means that I decided not to give up on China. I found the country so fascinating, and when I see how far China has come in such a short amount of time, and how deeply China is misunderstood in the West, I decided to stay and do whatever. I'm not naive. I understand that one man making a film every couple of years is not going to change the world, but I think the narrative needs to be changed, and people need to understand more about China and about the Chinese people, because that's something that very rarely gets into the Western press. We talk about China's technological achievements. We talk about Chinese IP theft and all these hot button issues that people love to feature. But in fact, this extraordinary transformation that has happened here has happened through millions of people working really hard for 30, 40 years and transforming basically a rural agrarian society into a extremely technologically sophisticated superpower.
You've been since then making several documentaries about China, always on hot button issues, about Hong Kong, about people's understanding of ordinary Chinese. So tell us how you chose your topic. How do you have access to these stories, which it seems that has been the topic between China and the United States, for example?
What I decided to do after Better Angels, because I really do passionately believe that China is misunderstood and victimized. And certainly China makes mistakes. We all know that. Every country makes mistakes. And I'm not trying to avoid that. But the point is that China is much more than just the mistakes that it occasionally makes. I have a kind of odd position, because I very much try to look for the subjects which I know China is going to, which are going to be global subjects. So after we made Better Angels, I went to Hong Kong and I made a film about the turmoil in Hong Kong. Before we even finished the Hong Kong film, I went to Wuhan, and I stayed in Wuhan with a crew of 18 international filmmakers, because I knew that COVID-19 was a perfect opportunity for China's enemies to attack China. And I wanted to see what it was really like and what was happening. And we stayed all the way until the lockdown was lifted. I couldn't get people to go because they were too frightened. And finally, we took people who ordinarily work in war zones, people who have a higher level of
sophistication about emergencies
and a higher tolerance for risk. And so we went in with the understanding that we did not know when we could come out. If we went in, they weren't going to let us out when we said, okay, we want to leave now. We were there for as long as it was going to be necessary to be there. So we could not leave until after the lockdown was finished, and we stayed for many, many, many weeks. But it was an extraordinary experience.
I know your documentary showed a lot, but beyond the stories that you told, as a filmmaker, as someone who lives in a city like that, and comparing to the rhetoric that is being reported now about China in Wuhan,
I think that the big takeaway for me was two or three things, really. First of all, I know that no one wanted to get locked up in their communities for week upon week upon week. Nobody would like that, and of course people were upset about that. But unlike in the West, the people of Wuhan trusted their government. And their government, which is hugely important, trusted their scientists. And because they trusted their scientists and locked down a city of 11 million people, they saved China. Because, this is a country of 1.4 billion people. Less than 5,000 people died. It's a tragedy that 5,000 people died. But when you compare that to the United States, where 780,000 people are dead and counting, China's achievement was extraordinary. And it was because China deployed huge state capacity very quickly. 42,000 doctors and nurses, over 40,000 construction workers, and they came within days. And it was just unimaginable to someone from the West to see that level of commitment by the Chinese people. And you know, a lot of the people we were filming every day in the ICUs were 22-year-old nurses, 28-year-old doctors, very, very young people who had volunteered and come. And they were intrepid, they were fantastic. So it showed the best.
But listening to you, you know, someone from outside this country who haven't been here for years would say, is Mr. Clark now trying to do propaganda for China?
No. I don't. I think my position is very precarious because the one thing that I found out in Better Angels was if you don't criticize China, overtly criticize China, then you must be bought and paid for by China. There's no middle ground.
Were there a lot of accusations against you about that then?
There were too many for me to enjoy it. It was, you know, I mean, where are you getting your money? I mean, that film was financed by Americans. You know, it was not financed by China. We took no money from China, and we don't take money from China. I think I have to remain independent, but I do know that there's a school of thought that says you are either anti-China or you're pro-China, but you can't just be in the middle and try and make a balanced, unbiased account of what you see and what happens. And you know, and as I say, I criticize China all the time, but what I try to do very hard is to be constructive. And you know, any country that says it's utopia is deluded. China is not a utopia. No country is. People make mistakes. Politicians make mistakes. We all make mistakes. But somehow China gets, in my opinion, gets unfairly hoist on its own petard for things that would be passed in other countries.
That's my interview with Malcolm Clark, a documentary filmmaker who's trying to tell the story as he sees it. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my teams in Guangzhou and in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.